Welcome to the Criminologist Podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Thank you. You are all going to make me blush with that heavy-duty affirmation. Welcome to episode 38 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Today I am happy to be bringing you what I'm referring to as our greatest hits episode, if you will. I was reflecting just the other day on all the fascinating, interesting people I've been able to meet on this journey as guests on my show here with the podcast. So I thought for those of you who might be newer to the show or who haven't listened to every episode, I could bring you again sort of a best of the criminologist up to this point. Now, if you're of my generation, you recall that when we were kids, you couldn't just download a single song on Spotify or ask your Alexa to play a favorite song of yours. You actually had to go out and buy, in most cases, you'd buy the entire album. And you may get 3 or 4 halfway decent songs on the album, but you were stuck with that whole album. Unless, of course, you waited for the band to release their greatest hits compilation. And then you again would get sort of the best of, if you will. So think of this as sort of the greatest hits thus far of some of the fascinating and intriguing guests that we've had the pleasure to interview here on The Criminologist. To be clear, I'm not talking about the clientele that we bring here on the show, although I could put together a greatest hits for them as well, but just really talking about the subject matter experts that we've been fortunate enough to meet again via interviewing folks on the show. So, without any ado, I'm going to bring you Nicole Renee Staley, who was our first guest on the show, which we really appreciate, Nicole, for being the first guest on the show. Nicole appeared on the show in episode 16. That episode was entitled Trauma-Informed Supervision Meets Desistance. Let's get a flavor of what Nicole and I talked about back then.
I'll let the band play there and the band play. I'll let the band play there and the band play. I'll let the band play there and the band play.
Maybe the best place to start is to bring awareness to the fact that anywhere, and there's a ton of research on this, and the statistics kind of fall within this range, but anywhere from 75 to 95% of criminally justice-involved individuals have experienced significant and repeated trauma in their lives. So you think about your caseload, 75 to 95%. And we're talking about things like interpersonal violence, childhood abuse and neglect, sexual assault, the witnessing of violence, the death of loved ones and friends, and that's just to name a few examples. So we know that individuals involved in the criminal justice system have this in their background. And the experience of and repetition of traumatic experiences impacts individuals in so many ways. There are neurobiological adaptations in how the brain develops, the development of pathways in the brain. There's cognitive and emotional effects that can lead to difficulties in emotional management and regulation, thinking patterns around the need to be in power and control. And finally, we see disruptions in interpersonal relationships and behaviors ranging everything from numbing and what we call disassociative behaviors, such as self-injurious behaviors, isolating, the use of alcohol and drugs to block out painful emotions or experiences. And then on the other end of the continuum, when we talk about how trauma impacts folks, we can see what we call hyperarousal behaviors, seeking out of dangerous situations, aggression towards others, or being kind of hypervigilant, that always on edge, right? Then you add to that all the fact that involvement in the criminal justice system in and of itself, from the first contact with police to incarceration, is often a traumatic experience for many, or at minimum has a re-traumatizing effect. So essentially triggering some of those trauma reactions and behaviors that we were just describing.
So there you heard Nicole talking a little bit about trauma and the role that plays in the change process for justice-involved individuals. You're going to hear that theme come up at least one more time by another guest who's made the Greatest Hits album here. Next, I'm excited to bring you a very special conversation, a bit of a conversation rather, that I had with our good friend, Dr. Guy Bourgogne. Guy is awesome. If you know Guy, I was able to entice Guy onto the show, and specifically I got him to talk about Spot the Dog, which is fantastic. So without any further ado, let's listen to Guy Bourgogne introduce you all, or reintroduce some of you maybe, to the inception of Spot the Dog.
Spot the Dog is certainly one of my favorites. The origin when it came back to God, it's got to be 1990 or thereabouts, and working in a jail, and sort of, I guess my clinical mentor, Dr. Barb Armstrong, she was always this super practical individual, and she's really good and understood all the cognitive behavioral stuff. And, we learned about Mike and Baum way back in the early 90s and Beck and all those other things. And I got to give her credit is that her frustration with trying to educate our guys that were in prison on the cognitive behavioral stuff and trying to give them sort of the textbook names and all this other stuff was incredibly frustrating. And that's where she goes, let me make it real to you. And virtually everybody knows how to train a dog, or at least can understand how to train a dog. And we use that analogy to sort of, establish the vocabulary of a basic, sequence of behaviors, the, technical terms, antecedents, stimuli, what your cognitions are, what the behavior is, what's the consequences. It's not just establishing that. I think one of the things that to me is probably the ultimate cool about Spot the Dog is it's a self-discovery journey for a client. And it doesn't matter whether the client is university educated or has grade 8 or even grade 5. They come to these conclusions through this exercise where they learn some incredibly valuable sort of lessons. That no matter how many times I tell somebody, the simple axiom that you're thinking is what causes your behavior and nothing else. To have somebody come up to that conclusion themselves and realize that, no, nobody makes me think anything. Nobody makes me, come to some conclusion or whatnot. It's entirely me, what I think. And whatever it is I think is what is really the cause of my action in the self-discovery process. Once they discover that, they can't go back. Mm-hmm. And even though they'd like to blame people, and we all do this, it doesn't have to be a correctional client. One of my favorites is that driver pissed me off while I'm driving. We're so easy to blame outside forces for our thinking, our emotions, or our behaviors. As soon as we sort of admit that, no, everything is me and my responsibility, it opens the door to going, okay, well, then I can change that. And it gives them an incredible sense of, in the desistance language, agency. Mm-hmm. In old school, self-efficacy. Other terms are empowerment and all those things. It's about a belief and a sense that I can change me. and I'm not just a feather in the wind. That's one of the coolest things about Spot the Dog is it shows what causes my actions, who's in charge of my thinking and my internal cues, for lack of a better word, and who has the power to change it or direct it. And realizing that it's all me leaves me in a position of power. And I love seeing my clients recognize that. And even though they have to struggle with it on a day-to-day basis, that whole notion that I can change me, that I have that power, is incredible.
Wow. And for those of you who dabble in cognitive behavioral interventions, what a impactful little insight into the key to change there. Thank you, Guy, for that. Again, that was episode 18, my interview with Dr. Burgon. Go back and have a listen if that intrigued you a little bit. It is a fascinating interview. Next, I want to share with you a little bit of my conversation that I had with Sean Trustin and Philip Galley. Sean and Phil are both faculty members at the University of Wisconsin River Falls campus. They came on the show to talk to me about a lot of things, but specifically we did a deep dive on their social support scale that they have developed. Social support is one of those things we talk about when we get into desistance. We all know the role that peers play if you're working within the risk needs responsivity model. I really had a great time talking to both Sean and Phil. They are both ex or current practitioners, so they bring a great blend of academia and practical experience to the job and to their views on, again, the client change process. So let's have a little bit of a listen of my interview with Sean Trustin and Phil Galley.
Yeah, so I think a couple things. I think taking the instrument to a different population, so an incarcerated population, and so we've talked about maybe a jail population as well as a Department of Corrections population. We've talked to some agencies, and then I'll let Sean talk about what kind of the opposite of positive support.
Yeah, sure. So the original scale had 40 some odd questions, I believe, 42, and the one we gave to clients now was 28, I believe. And really, getting people to fill out 28 is tough. 42, I would think would be, I wouldn't do it. I know that. Not on a voluntary basis, at least. So what we did was break it down into positive social support and negative social support. Phil mentioned it earlier, that kind of coercion side. So now we want to take those last questions, those other 14, and we'll tweak them or whatever, and see what kind of negative supports, how frequent that happened, that kind of coercive support where we've seen it in the system where family members teach other families, and that gets to that kind of social learning theory piece of you learn your behavior by watching somebody else. So did you have negative coercion, negative peer support, or negative support in your life from family or friends, and how did that impact your criminal behavior? And then that would just be another layer to this to be able to see. And then also talking about trying to get ideas from the general public about what their social support looks like, right? Going out and doing some randomized sampling at the local mall to see what their support looks like and how it compares to the clients. That would be a fascinating piece also.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, no, we've been asked that question. Have we taken this survey to just the general population? And that's an oversight, a little bit on our part. But yeah, I think Sean's right there. And then this idea of coercion, just to talk a little bit more about that. So coercion, again, theoretically, it kind of backs people into a corner, right? So it creates this or instills a sense of fear that they feel compelled to act a certain way. So we think maybe there's some sort of a relationship there. Because when Francis Cullen originally started talking about this, and then he and Mark Colvin and Thomas Van der Ven a couple years later put out this integrated theory. It included not only positive but negative social support as well, and it was a little bit much to kind of to bite off for us at the beginning. But I think we're getting close to being ready to start asking folks, what role does that negative support play in specifically criminal behavior, right? And then, again, this is down the road. Maybe we look at not just positive and negative support, but a complete absence of support, right? Are there folks that have a complete absence of support in their lives? crimes, possibly. And then hopefully being able to say, and this is again very, very pie in the sky, but can we predict criminal behavior based on level of support? Or we're not anywhere near that right now, but maybe in the future we can look at this idea of support, not necessarily just on its own, but is it predictive of specific crime types, violent crimes, property crimes, drug crimes, and so on and so forth. So.
Next, I am delighted to share with you a portion of my chat with Jane Mulcahy. Jane joined us all the way from over in Ireland and sort of kicked off the UK portion of our greatest hits episode here. Jane's going to share with you a little bit of her knowledge around ACEs. And again, we talked earlier when we were debriefing my interview with Nicole Staley about trauma. Here, Jane's going to talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. If you're not familiar with ACEs, I'm going to let Jane tell you all about that because she does a fantastic job of doing so.
Are very common. So over 60% of the 17,000 people who did the study had at least one childhood adversity, and around 12% had 4 or more. And these adversities were things like abuse or neglect, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, or living with someone in the home who had a mental illness, or who was drug addicted, or had an alcohol dependency, or living with someone who was incarcerated. And even among these very privileged sample, they found that childhood adversities were common. But the dose response was very important in terms of health and social outcomes. So the more adversities that a person accumulated, so if they had 4 or more, their risk of developing heart disease was doubled. Their risk of developing alcohol abuse was 7 times what it would be if you had no childhood adversities. And the attempted suicide risk was 12 times that of people who had no childhood adversities. And they've done subsequent studies where they found that, these things are, again, very common. They don't discriminate in terms of education level or geographical location, but the more recent studies have found that certain ethnic groups have more adversities, and this is due to things like systemic racism and inequality, and that women also are more likely to have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. There have been a few studies in the kind of criminal context and the juvenile justice context, and again, the more adversities that someone has in their childhood, the more likely that they'll have addictive behaviors. There's links with interpersonal violence, being a victim of violence and being a perpetrator of violence, and a range of mental health issues. So these are public health matters. And Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist, says frankly that adverse childhood experiences are the biggest public health threat of our time. Now, obviously, he said that before COVID-19, but they're the biggest kind of persistent, ongoing public health issue across the world. I would say it's not just an American issue. Every country has similar problems in this regard, and we are neglecting them.
As you rattle those off, I was thinking in my head, those are certainly variables that criminal justice practitioners come across with their clientele. And you, in fact, note that because justice-involved individuals are coming from communities in which they're surrounded by these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, that the criminal justice practitioner really needs to be aware of that to better understand their clients and then to better assist them. So maybe speak to our listeners about that, of how a lot of times we're working in this absence of they're not even cognizant of these ACEs, and to what degree does that hamper their ability to deliver services?
Well, a friend of mine, Ian Smith, I met him actually through the kind of Ace Aware Nation movement in Scotland. He is a successful criminal defense lawyer, and he only stumbled upon this ACEs science a couple of years ago, but it has transformed his thinking and his practice. And it's because he kind of always knew it. I mean, it's very hard to work in a field and not know that people are wounded, but you don't quite get what it does to the developing brain and body until you're presented with the science, until you do a bit of research, and you kind of realize that actually in many ways we're all the same. We need the same things to flourish and be healthy. And if we're denied them in our development, if we're exposed to the pernicious harm of racism, if we grow up in a home that's chronically stressed because of poverty, if our parent is self-medicating because of their own unprocessed trauma, how in God's name are we meant to concentrate in a classroom and behave ourselves well and learn and be able to make or sustain healthy relationships with our peers? And then we also develop a lack of trust in humanity because of the lack of safety in our formative years, so that we go out into the world expecting humans to be brutal and vicious and demeaning. And the criminal justice system, particularly in the States, is quite traumatic and re-traumatizing. It's also that in Ireland, but maybe not quite to the same degree. But by not understanding what an accumulation of risk factors in the language of risk assessment does actually to our neuroendocrine system, to our stress response system, how it impairs our ability actually to access our cortical thinking brain, then we as practitioners are not going to engage with people really in a kind of helpful way. We might actually make things worse for them. Or if we're criminal defense lawyers, we're just not making the most compassionate case for someone to a judge. And judges, of course, as well don't have this information and might be more punitive minded. Or we judge people, I suppose, from our own experiences often. And if we haven't experienced a lot of adversity, well, we're in the comfortable place of not being able to imagine what we might be like under different circumstances. And from having learned about all of this, I actually quite marvel some of the time at people's capacity to keep on going, even if it means that they use drugs and alcohol to survive, because that's why they're doing it. It is literally to survive with the pain and the lack of safety in their bodies around other people.
Thank you so much, Jane. Good stuff. If you work with justice-involved individuals, you need to go down the ACEs rabbit hole. That was a great interview with Jane. She talked about so much more just beyond ACEs. And again, that was episode 27, Jane Mulcahy. I cannot tell you how thrilled it was to get our next guest on the show. David Adams joined us from the south of England. David is what I refer to as a true subject matter expert when it comes to the topic of desistance from crime. David is a formerly justice-involved individual, which, as I say, in my opinion, makes him a true subject expert when it comes to the process of desistance from crime. Here, David talks to you a little bit about himself and his projects and how he crossed paths with another guest who I'll be highlighting here shortly. So let's have a listen to my conversation with David Adams.
It's a weird one. I think, the punishment is your freedom's taken away. You're not allowed to see your family, your friends, and have the life. And that's where it should stop. I mean, what's the point in putting someone in prison, throwing away, the key, not give them anything, and then just making them angry? So when they come out, they are angry still. They're probably even more angry when they went in. and they come out and they hate the system, they hate everything, they hate authority, and they've got this hate in them. What good is that doing for our society? It's not good for them. It's not good for the neighbours they might be moving to, or the community they're moving back to. So we really need to sort of change the way in the prisons, try and nurture everybody like myself, and even try and change the mindsets of the people that are outside the prison. Because a lot of people aren't aware of what goes on in the prisons. But if we could start changing those perspectives, then I reckon we can do a lot more to support people like myself and really make a difference.
It's interesting tale. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've surfed since I was a very young lad, and just before I went to prison, I started getting into stand-up paddleboarding, and I really enjoyed it. I loved it. And when I was sitting in prison, I was reading all the magazines and everything, and I was realizing that, I wanted to do these adventures. I wanted to get outside more because I'm locked up in prison. I was like, I don't want to be locked up anymore. I was coming out, and I came up with all these ideas of what I can do for paddleboarding. So I've been out, 7 months. I'm now a sponsored paddleboarder. I'm doing a charity event this weekend. I'm paddleboarding 50 kilometers carrying a baby oak tree for a tree growing organization to highlight youth unemployment in the UK. I'm working on a campaign to set some world records in the longest rivers in the UK and Europe. I'm also working to become the first person to paddleboard the length of the Skeleton Coast and the River Nile. It's all going very well at the moment, and it's sort of using the story where I've come from to show that, my mistakes do not define who I am. And it's, again, if I can go out and do these things, and hopefully I can inspire others to make that positive change in their life somewhere, and, grow through adventure, understand who they are. Yeah, I tell you what, Dr. Sarah Lewis is probably one of the most inspirational women I've ever met. And meeting her was really a turning point in my life. I met her at HMP Guy's Marsh. It's a CCAT category prison. We have sort of 4 categories, and it's the 3rd sort of lowest risk. And she does a lot over in Scandinavia. She went over there, learned what they do and how they got their reoffending rates really low down. And she tried to bring it over to the UK, and Guy's Marsh sort of said, all right, we'll let her in, let's give her a chance. So she created this growth project, and sort of trying to embrace these different mindsets and trying to do different things to change prison environments. And I remember once we had the sports hall, and she did this well-being yoga day. So basically all we did was just go and do yoga all day in the sports hall. So instead of being locked up behind our cell doors, we were there in the sports hall. I just remember seeing Sarah, seeing the team she had around her, and actually making a difference. I was seeing all the other lads that, were in prison with me, all smiling. And I was like, I want to be part of this. I need to get a part of this. So I went up to Sarah, I started chatting with her, and she said, yeah, we're going to interview some more people soon. So I went to the interview, joined her team, and then I've never looked back. And I still work with Sarah now. I'm out, I'm free, and we're working together, trying to make a difference over here in the UK and hopefully one day globally.
On the Midway, played by Isla Orchestra. On the Midway, played by Isla Orchestra.
You heard David there reference Dr. Sarah Lewis, Director of Penal Reform Solutions. She is a remarkable individual, also the founder of the Growth Alliance. I was honored to interview Sarah Lewis for my show. I also appeared on her podcast, Growth Uncut. If you are listening, Sarah, Avengers Assemble! So now you are the Director of Penal Reform Solutions. Let's dive into that, Sarah.
Yeah, so I love my job. I've been here since 2016, and I think, that's the great thing, I guess, about setting up a company is that you get to choose and kind of carve out what you love about everything in your work and then make it a reality, really. But the main things we focus on is just how organizational growth, so how we can support people in creating a kind of more humane, a more trusting, a more safe environment within their work, so that they feel better and we get all the fruits that come with that, really. So we work in prisons, we work in probation, we work with charities. So basically any organisation that kind of kind of requires that in some senses, that are maybe experiencing some of that kind of chaos or reactive nature to things or difficulties, particularly, let's say, around retention of staff or high levels of harm, I guess. So we kind of go in and when I say we've got a collection of people that work for us. So you had the pleasure of meeting lovely David, who's on the team. And, we've got about 8 former prisoners that work for us. So they're either mentors or they work within our marketing kind of work, or they support us in developing programs to support desistance in different ways within prison environment. And we work alongside, whether that's former practitioners, so probation practitioners or prison officers. We very much love the idea of that kind of multidisciplinary work, so that we can really learn off one another and get, create a really kind of critical space, really, where we can get the best response, really, that kind of focuses on sustainability. So it's about the long game rather than maybe this kind of plaster mentality, this microwave solutions of like, let's just do some quick wins and not maybe focus on the bigger picture. So we've developed training for practitioners that work with individuals that have maybe got complex needs or come from marginalised backgrounds. We do a number of different kind of innovative projects. We do some preventative stuff. So 3 of the guys that I met in prison, they are currently on our books to do some schoolwork, to go into schools and talk about prison and talk about their experiences of prison and in being involved in gangs and their kind of experience of violence, really. So we focus on the kind of preventative stuff as well as the kind of sustainability stuff, really. And I love it. I absolutely love it. It's just brilliant.
Find a job you love and you'll never work a day the rest of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't plan to retire ever.
So now from Penal Reform Solutions, you found the Growth Alliance, or explain the relationship between those two entities?
Yeah, so when I started PRS, I guess for me, I kind of thought I'm going to be like Elizabeth Fry, and I'm going to go from prison to prison and make a difference. And I kind of experienced or reflected quite quickly that wasn't going to I wasn't going to have enough time to do that in terms of the impact I guess I wanted to make. So the Growth Alliance started last year, and we have about 6 founding members that were also on board with it, really. And it came about again through a real kind of informal conversation with someone who had the same kind of passion for more of a social movement. So it was more around how we can connect together and make a collective impact, rather than just all of us working in our silos and meeting our own targets and trying hard to make criminal justice a kind of safer and less harmful place, really. So the Growth Alliance is open to anyone. Anyone can join, and with that, pre-COVID, we were doing kind of regular events and trying hard to, I guess, build a kind of collaborative force. I kind of talk a little bit about it like the Avengers. We're trying to find Avengers in the world that want to be on board, and we're going to smash Thanos, which essentially represents, I guess, that kind of lack of humanity and all that kind of harm that we kind of experience, really. So it's all about getting together. It's all about coming together to make a bigger impact. That's what the Growth Alliance is all about.
I love the Avengers analogy. We are going to conclude the UK portion of this greatest hits episode by sharing a bit of my conversation that I had with Dr. Sarah Anderson, Edinburgh Napier University. She talks to us about trauma, desistance, so much more. I could talk to Sarah forever. So I'm going to give you a little bit of this episode. If you're intrigued, you can go back and listen to the entire episode. That was episode 13, our chat with Dr. Sarah Anderson, Edinburgh Napier University. And here's a sneak peek.
Yeah, so when I finished my master's, I promised myself I'd never go back to academia, but here I am. I went to study a PhD at University of Glasgow. So I moved from London up to Scotland. So I did the PhD under Professor Fergus McNeill and then Professor Sally Wyke, who is professor in the sociology of health. And obviously my PhD was just really shaped by all of the work I'd been doing previously. And it was focused, so at the time I wanted to look at the relationship between desistance from offending, so the process of moving away from offending, and also the process of recovery from trauma. And in particular, how those processes and the interaction between them were reflected in people's self-narratives. And the reasons I had for doing that was, the research was focused on men. And at the time, I think this has changed notably since I was applying to do my PhD, which is, back in 2013 now. But at the time, there was a lot of talk, at least in the UK, about women in the criminal justice system as having experienced trauma, and this being a significant factor that they needed to negotiate in their journeys through and away from the criminal justice system. So I became interested in men because my practice experience had, told me that men also experienced trauma that stayed with them and shaped their lives in certain ways. So that was one of the focus. And then I'd noticed this, and as well as noticing, people were dealing with trauma that they kind of carried with them. I also wanted to look at, sorry, I'm going to lose my train of thought. I'm terrible for this. I also just saw overlaps in those two processes. So I'd been reading a lot in the literature about desistance from crime and reading a lot of the literature around trauma recovery. And these processes both emphasized the role of self-narratives and transformation of narratives in those journeys, and also reconnection with people and relationships as being integral to that. And I think seeing these overlaps between these processes made me interested in studying, what does one have to do with the other?
So talk about that a little bit more, if you would. Again, loyal listeners to the show, they've heard me talk about desistance, and as you noted, the narrative process, that sort of identity transformation piece. What are some of those overlapping things that you saw in the trauma process, which overlaid or were in common? Now I'm losing my train of thought with the desistance journey and the trauma journey that drew you to those sort of parallels, if you would.
Yeah, of course. So in desistance, it's been suggested that a self-narrative, so a story of one's own life, which you tell to yourself, that a self-narrative which previously supported further offending needs to be rewritten to produce a self-narrative which supports desistance. So the self-narrative is closely linked to your identity, and the idea is that this identity provides a blueprint for non-offending behavior. The idea that a person like me doesn't do something like this, and that identity has a really important role in shaping the decisions we make. So that's built on the work of Giordano and also Shad Maruna as well. Now, a very different set of literature, but I was interested in the trauma literature. They often focus on how trauma can disrupt or shatter self-narratives. It can shatter this thread between past, present, and future. And so the process of recovery from trauma also involves a process of kind of biographical reconstruction, which is closely linked to, identity change. People who write about trauma have said that while the restoration of an old identity may be possible after trauma, actually the process frequently involves a forging of a new identity. So that's one element of it. As I said, the other element is a focus on reconnection, and I guess this also draws out the idea that I was heavily influenced by views of identity that see the way we see ourselves as being intimately related to the ways that other people see us. And that forging connections with others can be important for changing the way we see ourselves and our sense of belonging. And again, this is something that's really emphasized in the trauma literature, this reconnection, and increasingly present within the desistance literature, focusing on the role of relationships in the co-construction of desistance narratives. So, for example, Beth Weaver's work was quite an important influence for me there. I think her work, if anyone's not read her book, I think it's an amazing piece of academic scholarship, and beautifully written as well, that shows the way that other people, that our processes of change rely and emerge through these connections that we build and maintain with others, but also the context in which those relationships take place as well.
So fascinating to learn from Sarah Anderson, as it was from all the guests, which I've been able to share with you here. Apologies to Glenn Tapia and Jack Crowley. Guys, I don't know what happened to your interviews. They are lost somewhere within the mystery of my hard drive. I would have included you, of course, on this greatest hits compilation. So shout out to Jack Crowley from Alpha USA and Glenn Tapia of ACJI out in Denver, Colorado. Go back, listen to their episodes as well. Glenn was episode 23, and Jack Crowley I interviewed for where are you here, Jack? Episode 32. So go back, listen to those episodes. Guys, I'm going to have you back on the show to make up for this faux pas. This concludes this episode. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions, feel free to contact me directly via the show's email, thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and or Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. You can also connect with me, on LinkedIn, Joseph Arvidsson on LinkedIn, and follow both The Criminologist Podcast and The Paragon Group on their respective LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you have not already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to what you hear here on this podcast. Merchandise is available. Finally, if you believe in what we're doing here on the show, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so, if you have not already done so, yourself. And always remember, folks, there's no them. There's only us.
Avengers!
Assemble.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.